Welcome to the Quo Vadis Report, a show based upon the teaching of thinking globally and acting locally. I have a very special guest today, Reverend Chloe Breye of the Interfaith Center of New York. Welcome, Chloe.
Thank you so much for having me on today, Don.
Today is very specially meaningful to me as a board member of the Interfaith Center of New York because it focuses on the interfaith movement. Interfaith is very key to being a New Yorker, growing up in New York, about the differences, and it's informed a lot of my life. Tell me a little bit about what interfaith means to you and what you bring to it.
John, as a New Yorker living in one of the most diverse cities in the world, I have had the privilege both as serving as an Episcopal priest and then executive director for the Interfaith Center of New York, which is a nonprofit organization that works with hundreds of faith leaders from around the city, from 15 different traditions, and we put grassroots religious leaders in dialogue with each other and with civic officials like judges, teachers, social workers to solve really practical common problems on the ground. Domestic violence, food security, the problems that we have with credit card debt and foreclosure. To everyone, this definition of interfaith is a specific one. It's not so much the bishops and imams and high-level religious leaders dialoguing over matters of doctrine. We're really getting our hands dirty on the ground because in order to make our city and world safe for religious diversity, which is our mission, we found that working with immigrant religious leaders and grassroots folks with real constituencies is actually what makes the city a safer and more vibrant place to be. Has religion throughout human history been more a part of the problem or more part of the solution? You'd have an interesting dialogue about that because you look back in history and the number of people who have died fighting over religion, and it's really pretty shocking. At the same time, however, we draw on a strand of religious peacemaking that goes back to St. Francis. It goes back to a number of religious leaders who've really fought the trend and thought that it's about living together in harmony no matter what your tradition is.
Well, tell me about St. Francis. He's one of my favorite people. I have him out in the garden. I refer to him oftentimes. I don't associate him in being in the context of interfaith. How does St. Francis enter the picture? Yeah,
we see him in iconography and paintings blessing the animals, but in some ways, one of the greatest stories about St. Francis is the time that during, I think it was one of the Crusades, when he set off and crossed enemy lines in Damietta in Egypt and went himself to meet with the Sultan of Egypt, who was intrigued by this man of peace who came in a brown robe that perhaps reminded him of Sufis in his own tradition. St. Francis spent 3 days in the Sultan's court. And during that time, his own hope, of course, had been they thought they could convert one another. They didn't manage to, but they developed an enormous respect for one another. And at that point, St. Francis, he walked back across again the fields of battle, and he increased his adamancy about violence not being the solution to the problems that they were facing back in the time.
Tell us a little bit about how that plays into it.
Yeah, the founder of the Interfaith Center, the very Reverend James Parks Morton, he was the Dean of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and beginning in the 70s, at a time when interfaith was just not on the map. And our understanding of interfaith was perhaps a Methodist Episcopal dialogue. And so when Jim Morton brought Shinto priests into the cathedral and Native American practitioners, he really shocked the city, but laid the groundwork as a pioneer for interfaith work that we have now come to see as a critical part of a peaceful world, particularly after 9/11. And this was a watershed moment for us at the Interfaith Center. When Jim Morton left the cathedral in '97, he established the Interfaith Center, and I would say we spent quite a bit of time doing the same things he'd done at the cathedral, large services, embracing the way the arts reaches across faith traditions. When 9/11 happened, however, we realized that there was a degree of urgency around what we were doing that hadn't taken place before.
Were you part of the cathedral at that point? I know there was a period of time in your history when you were part of the cathedral as well.
Yeah, I was there at the cathedral in in 2000 and, I was doing a chapel for 5th through 8th graders when I heard that 2 planes had hit the World Trade Center. And it was a time when I, like so many other religious leaders in the city, went to volunteer down at the World Trade Center site and at the morgue on 30th Street. And it was a time when, as you know, the city pulled together and really we sought to support one another. And it was out of that experience as being a volunteer chaplain that I actually am doing a lot of funerals and memorial services for people who had lost loved ones there. I felt called to take part in an interfaith effort that our diocese was leading to rebuild a mosque in Afghanistan. We'd heard from our president in the fall of 2001 that this was not a war against Islam. And our bishop at the time, wanted to put flesh on those words. And we found that a mosque outside of Kabul had been hit by our own U.S. bombs as collateral damage after November of 2001, and we thought, let's work together with the Afghan community in Flushing, New York, across the way, raise money to rebuild this mosque, and that's what we did. And that began a journey for me that has included 6 trips back to Afghanistan and the subsequent 10 years work on a women's health clinic, on a number of different humanitarian projects over there, and that's also what propelled me to take up this job as the director at the Interfaith Center.
Well, that's the new balance that you're bringing to the Interfaith Center as the executive director, is between the large-scale issues of the day and the people that are involved in it at a very high level, because they need to be engaged, whether it's at the United Nations, the City of New York, whatever it may be, to engage at that level. But it's also that action. The action has to be down to earth. It has to be around social justice. It has to be about education and things like that. Tell me about some of the programs that you've been involved with through the Interfaith Center that really take this to heart.
It's funny because when we started, we had a lot of programs about peace and interfaith understanding, and then we found that there was only a certain number of the same people started showing up. Those were people from a number of different traditions who already had the mostly liberal belief that religions can get along.
Preaching to the converted, as it were.
We were certainly doing that. And what we found was that when we shifted our focus to really practical problems on the ground, like domestic violence, like how do we solve, critical economic issues, homelessness, that we got a much more diverse group of folks who would come to the table. And we suddenly had the Nigerian sheikh from West Harlem coming and being in the same room as the Orthodox rabbi from Brooklyn, and both of them had real constituencies that they were trying to help, and in the coffee hour they might have a little conversation. So that was a moment of a critical turning point for us. And we also discovered that when we partner with major city institutions like the courts, like the public libraries, we have a chance to do interfaith problem solving in the public square. And that is so exciting, because not only are we engaging grassroots religious leaders on a sort of the importance of being a leader in the wider community, right, we're also telling judges, teachers, and religious leaders that religious diversity is a gift that this city has to offer. It is not a liability, and that we are a stronger city because of the work that we all do together. The examples of the program that come to mind are these roundtables that we do in all the boroughs, in the courts, so that you have a religious leader who may have, their experience of the criminal justice system may have been supporting a congregation member who was stopped and frisked, or, we don't, in too many of our minority communities, we don't see the courts as a gift or an important part of the city. When they come in and meet the civic officials that are there, learn more about the resources that the courts have to offer, it changes their perspective. I'm just thinking of a really amazing program that we have working with houses of worship on being sites for supervised exchange of children where there has been a history of domestic violence or animosity between the parents. Too many of our poor families in the city have to do that exchange in a precinct, in a police environment where you leave a child so one parent can go and the other can pick them up. And we thought that perhaps what we could do is have a house of worship be that drop-off point for families in need of that service. And it's been a really exciting thing to see happen.
It sounds like the Interfaith Center has two main aspects to it. One is the educational programs that it offers, and then there's the civic connections.
Sure, yeah.
And so you have these two things going. If you don't have some larger conversation at a civic level, nothing is going to take place. But if you don't have a kind of a theoretical background, and you don't have a framework of approaching it, that doesn't work. So the Interfaith Center is working at both ends. And you see up on screen how it breaks out to the civic connections and the educational programs. One of the important grounding programs that's begun from the very beginning of the Interfaith Center back in 97 and 98 is the Marshall Meyer retreats. Some of the early ones were on domestic violences, on some of these same issues that keep popping up. So you do need the larger educational formats for the religious leaders, for the people, but then also the programs. Let's fast forward to our period of time right now. We've had a couple of flashpoints in the last couple of years in New York. We have the Koran burning, the potential Koran burning. We have the 2011 10-year event. We also have the issues that take place with the police department.
Right.
So how does the Interfaith Center see itself as an advocate for certain positions along with establishing a meaningful dialogue? How does the Interfaith Center fall out on that?
Our bread and butter programs are what builds a real constituency, so when fires break out in our city, we can be on the front line. And I think in particular of the controversy around the proposed Islamic Center at Ground Zero.
Thank you for not calling it a mosque. It's not a mosque.
So our fellow board member, Imam Faisal Rauf, and his wife, Daisy Khan, had a vision of trying to build this Islamic center that would honor the part of Islam that is one which really furthers the American values, as he constantly is saying. His right and their right to exercise their religious freedom and build a house of worship in a place that had been there for a long time and served, among the 8,000 to 10,000 Muslim New Yorkers who either work or live below 14th Street. We stood up strongly at a time when too many religious leaders were being quiet and were stepping back, and we interestingly had to look to our political leaders. At that time, Mayor Bloomberg was really in a very courageous way standing in front of the Statue of Liberty in August of 2010 at a time when the internet was going crazy with Islamophobic comments, when mosques proposed in Sheepshead Bay and in Staten Island were being demonstrated against in the same way that we saw a century ago Roman Catholic houses of worship being shut down and being demonstrated against. We heard the mayor said, this is not my tradition, but we're going to stand up for religious freedom because that's part of who we are as New Yorkers and who we are as Americans. And the Interfaith Centers took a very strong stand with many of our interfaith partners on that, to the degree that the following year we joined with the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs and the New York Community Trust in starting over 250 coffee hour conversations between New Yorkers of all different faith around the 10th anniversary, because we were so determined that the 10th anniversary of 9/11 would not be used by those individuals who wanted to separate us and polarize us. It had to be focused on the tragic events, how they touched too many lives in our city, and honor that day with the respect that it deserved. And I'm so proud to say that with the Tannenbaum Center of New York, Intersections International, Auburn Seminary, and so many other interfaith and other organizations around the city, we helped make that day be one of respect and grief, as it should have been, as opposed to fomenting hatred, which we'd seen the year before.
One of the most difficult aspects of our life is social justice, because that's a very important portion of the Interfaith Center's focus. And you come from a background in your family of issues of not only multicultural, multi-religious background, but having a very famous father who's in the justice areas. How have you balanced out the need for social justice with the larger spiritual concerns?
Well, it's not so much a question of balance, because I think at the heart of of so many of our religious traditions, and certainly at the heart of my own tradition as a priest in the Episcopal Church. Social justice is inseparable from the key teachings of the gospel. And I work as an associate minister at St. Mary's Episcopal Church in West Harlem, and it's from what I do at the altar on Sundays that my expression of the work of social justice sees itself in the work of the Interfaith Center. I don't see those two things as by and large different. The model that I take for all of what we do, the religious leaders that are involved in our work, is Martin Luther King. And it's not just a Christian example, because he was a master at being able to preach from the pulpit in the language of his primary faith tradition, something that his congregants understood and inspired them. At the same time, he walked on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and gave that amazing speech about the bounce check. He used a secular metaphor that no matter who you were, whether you were Jewish, Christian, Muslim, a person of non-faith, you could understand that secular metaphor and be moved to take action for the common good. So he's a model, I think, that's not just for Christians. He's a model for every person of faith, and also those of no faith, that you have a language that you communicate to your primary community, but you also have to learn to translate when you step into the pluralistic public square that is at the heart of our democracy. So he really is an example for me, and I think for many of our other religious leaders of different faith traditions.
One of the most important focuses in the life of the Interfaith Center is the annual James Parks Morton Award. This is the 10th award coming up, and tell me a little bit about this year and the history of the award.
So this year, on June 11th at the Tribeca rooftop, we will be having the 10th annual James Parks Morton Interfaith Award, honoring Nobel Peace Prize laureate Lema Bowie and filmmaker Abigail Disney. And this is it's such an important event. It is named after our founder, the very Reverend James Parks Morton. In the past, we have honored many Nobel laureates, from Bishop Desmond Tutu to Shirin Ebadi and Mohammed El-Baradi, also artists ranging from Philippe Petit to Wynton Marsalis and Philip Glass, and our former President Bill Clinton as well, recognizing that people in different walks of life who embody the values of peace and interfaith understanding that Jim Morton himself has dedicated his life to. This year, we are so excited to have particularly Lema Bowie and Abigail Disney, because the work that Lema Bowie did, that Abigail Disney documents in her Pray the Devil Back to Hell, is an extraordinary example of interfaith peacemaking. Lema Bowie, as you may know, is a Christian woman activist who got other Christian women at the time when Charles Taylor and the rebels in Liberia were terrorizing the country. She sat down with these women and Muslim women who were tired of war, and they had a nonviolent protest that took many weeks outside the president's palace, and put their bodies on the line and came forward to ask President Taylor if he could please stop the war, the rape, the killing, all these atrocities that had made life so miserable for them and their family. They didn't stop there. The Muslim women went and challenged the rebels to put their arms down, and they got as far as peace talks in the Ivory Coast. When those peace talks were stalling because everyone was happy inside ordering room service, those women again occupied the hallways of the hotel and said, "We're not going to move until you come to a real peace agreement." And then when that agreement was actually signed and begun to be implemented, they worked together to elect the first women head of state in an African country, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. So the work that they did and the story that was so close to being lost, as so many women's stories are in history, was caught by Abigail Disney, who realized that something extraordinary had happened and dedicated many years of her life to documenting reenacting that story.
That was her first entry into the filmmaking. Obviously, she has a storied history with her family, but this was her first venture into the world of documentaries.
Well, she has done an extraordinary job with Pray the Devil Back to Hell, and then another series that aired this past fall on PBS, Women, War and Peace. She is a dedicated filmmaker and activist that has really identified something that's been in operation for many hundreds of years, and that is the role that women of faith have played in creating a safer world.
Money, greed, ethnicity,
absolute power.
there is nothing that should make people do what they did to the children of Liberia. The warlords gave these boys guns and sent them off.
They just do anything because they had guns.
You go to bed saying, God, please, what do we do? I had a dream, and it was like a crazy dream. We decided to protest. We wore the white, saying to people we were out for peace.
Thousands of women, Muslim and Christian, were coming together,
calling for peace. These women had seen the worst, but they still had that vibrance for life.
and we said, well, if I should get killed, just remember me that I was fighting for peace.
We stepped out first and did the unimaginable. To send out a signal to the world that we, the Liberian women, we are tired of the killing of our people. We can do it again if we want to.
I want to hear now, gratefully acknowledge the powerful voice of women.
So June 11th again is we'll be airing the film, then presenting the awards, and more can be learned about it on our website at www.interfaithcenter.org.
One of the cultural elements of the Interfaith Center that's a leitmotif from the very beginning is arts. You mentioned Philip Glass, Luther Masalis, but there's always been the arts. This year we have the Forces of Nature.
That's right.
And they are a tremendously vital dance group that just bring these things to life. And I'm looking forward to them as well.
No, it's going to be an incredibly exciting evening, and you know, we hope that everyone will join us for it.
And we have a wonderful moderator.
Alfonso, Dr. Alfonso Wyatt
Okay.
with the AME Cathedral, and formerly with the Fund for the City of New York, an extraordinary leader in New York City and mentor to so many, and a real founding presence of the Interfaith Center of New York. So we are thrilled that he'll be the MC for the evening.
And people will have an opportunity to take away a very tangible memento. They're going to be quilts that have been produced in Liberia. Right. They're really visual. You can see them up on the screen right now. They're just wonderful exemplars of what happens when people cooperatively work together to produce something of beauty.
Yeah, it's that is an amazing part of the evening as well, which you know, the Liberian Women's Cooperative that has produced these quilts have, you know, with their own hands given us artwork that is something that we can treasure. And I think they'll also be doing something really special, a quilt that actually has Lema Bowie and Abigail Disney's image on it. So that will be something that they're just doing for the evening.
Are there any more things that you are interested in right now in the Interfaith Center that you'd like to share with us?
I do. I mean, actually, what you said just reminds me of, I'm from Massachusetts originally, where Tip O'Neill used to say, you know, all politics is local. I have slightly adapted that to say all interfaith work is local, because in some ways, that was what we found at the Interfaith Center of New York. And I can think of a a program that we're doing that actually began with an effort by something called iDebate, which is an organization that works with youth all over the world to teach debating practices as a way of gaining leadership development for young people. And we've worked with them to help develop debate skills for Sikh, Muslim, and Hindu young people out in Queens, and putting them together with other young people of different faiths than their own to take on completely pressing issues that we face today as a society, namely the balance between security and civil liberties. And it's been so inspiring to see these young people getting up and in front of their peers, many of whom were quite shy, but are learning public speaking skills and watching them engage in ice-breaking exercises like imagining they are on a balloon that's losing hot air, and 9 of them are public figures from Mother Teresa to Martin Luther King, and they have to make an argument about why they shouldn't be voted off the balloon. And it's been so great to see these Sikh, Hindu, and Muslim youth doing that leadership work. Yeah.
It must be an interesting exercise, because in a debate process you have to sometimes take on the role that you would not ordinarily be. Take a position opposed to what you're comfortable with. That's a wonderful exercise to develop a perspective for these young people.
I think it's important because it's not about just winning a debate. It's about putting yourself in the mind and position of someone else, which is a key part of what it means to be a democracy, where we're asked to live with people whose views and religious traditions are so different from our own. And I think if we can have the practice, it doesn't mean leaving our faith at the door. It doesn't mean we water down our religious tradition. To the contrary, it means that we acknowledge we live